Уважаемые коллеги,
Dear colleagues, we are beginning the press conference of the Foreign Minister of the Russian Federation, Sergei Lavrov. It will take place in the Russian language. There will be translation provided into 3 other languages. After the introductory remarks, you will have an opportunity to ask your questions. Please identify yourself before asking your question. On to the Minister. Good morning, dear colleagues. As has already become our tradition, we meet at the beginning of the new year in order to discuss the events and outcomes of the year 2022, which was not easy and to a certain extent unique, because in 2022, profound tendencies in geopolitics, in international aspirations of the leading countries have become even more clear. These trends have been developing for decades. Naturally, our Western colleagues were trying to turn Ukraine and the situation around it into the main event for the media, as well as in politics and economics. They accused Russia of so-called aggression against Ukraine, alleging that it was the reason behind all the woes in global economy. I won't even waste my breath trying to refute these claims, because the statistics of the World Bank and the IMF, as well as the FAO and other international structures have been indicating that the crisis had been developing even before the beginning of the special military operation, and President Putin had given data about the situation in the world economy being entirely due to the selfish position of the United States and its allies. What is going on in Ukraine at the moment arose from the United States and its satellites' years-long preparation to starting a global hybrid war against the Russian Federation. And no one is even trying to disguise that. If you read statements by Western politicians, political scientists, you can easily see that for yourself. A few days ago, professor of the University of Columbia was published, and he said we were not in a cold war with Russia. He said we are in a hot war with Russia, and NATO is fighting Russia in Ukraine. These confessions are quite obvious. They are on the surface level, and it is bizarre to see various attempts to deny that. And President Milanovic of Croatia recently said that it was NATO's war. He was frank and honest when he said that. A few weeks ago, Henry Kissinger, before calling upon NATO to make Ukraine another member, in one of his most recent articles, he said that what was going on in Ukraine was a clash and competition between 2 nuclear powers for control over this territory. I believe it is quite clear what this was all about. That is why when our Western partners foam at the mouth, trying to prove that they have nothing to do with that, they only try to help Ukraine overcome aggression and restore its territorial integrity, they are not being entirely truthful. The amount of their military support testify that the West is banking a lot on this war against Russia. It is quite clear because the events in Ukraine shed light on the United States' desire to seize, trying using legitimate means to strengthen its world positions and take up illegitimate methods for ensuring its dominance. They spare no effort. It's not just what we see in Ukraine. They also destroyed all those mechanisms that the West, headed by the US, created, the mechanisms of the free market, loyal competition, free entrepreneurship, presumption of innocence, inviolability of private property. Everything that the Western globalization model was founded on has collapsed. And right now, sanctions are being used against Russia and other undesirable states simply because they refuse to comply with their ideas. But tomorrow, these sanctions can be used against any other country that refuses to blindly follow American orders. As for the European Union, I don't think we need to speak about that for a long time. The EU is now completely following the American dictate, and this process that has been fomenting for a few years has recently culminated in a joint declaration between NATO and the EU. It happened on the 10th of January. And the declaration said that NATO and the EU will use all of their economic and military means in the interests of the Golden Billion, in the interests of our 1 billion of citizens of NATO and EU countries. According to Borrell, the rest of the world is the jungle that is in the way of the development of this blossoming garden, and this jungle needs to be reformatted, needs to be turned into a colony of the new formation and get resources from them using new methods. Blackmail, demonization and sanctions, threat of use of force, those are some of the methods they use to achieve their goals. The West has taken up the policy of destroying the traditional ties between historic partners in various parts of the world and destabilization of various regions. We see it in the Balkans, in the post-Soviet space, especially if we consider the activities of the United States and its acolytes and clients in South Caucasus, and naturally everything that is going on in Ukraine that has been developing for a long time. For example, in 2004, when the first Maidan took place, European officials said for the first time, Ukraine needs to choose. Is it with the West or is it with Russia? This either-or policy has been visible in the West's policy regarding this region in a consistent manner, and those who made the wrong choice and wanted historic ties and brotherhood traditions and religious ties with Russia matter. Initially, the West would crush them. They would try to exclude them from political life. They would prosecute them. They would assassinate journalists and politicians. They would shut down media outlets if they refused to spread the official position. The police state used all means available, and right now the process is over with the silent approval of the West. And the alternative choice, either or, West or Russia, were needed to identify those who were against the West, who were not with the West. And the West started punishing these people. And let's get back to the declaration. It's an interesting paper indeed. And the EU and NATO were proclaimed to be an alliance of democracies against autocracies amid global competition. This confrontational agenda was proclaimed for the entire world to hear. And just like I have already pointed out, Europe has lost its independence. And the joint declaration explicitly states that Europeans are subjugated to NATO essentially containing an obligation to serve American interests in geopolitical containment of Russia and China. They also proclaimed the goal that was well known to everyone, but now they put it on paper: achieving global superiority of NATO headed by the United States. NATO does not restrict itself to simply organizing Europe. During the Madrid summit that took place in June 2022, they proclaimed global responsibility of this military bloc, especially when it comes to the Asia-Pacific region, that NATO chooses to call the Indo-Pacific. Here the attempt is clear. They are trying to involve India in this process in order to further complicate their relations with China. Moreover, they also proclaimed indivisibility of security in the Euro-Atlantic and the Indo-Pacific. A play upon words. Previously, in the OSCE and the Russia-NATO Council, starting from 1990s, we would speak about indivisibility of security, which meant equal security for each state, and the obligation not to strengthen your security at the expense of the security of others. This term is now used out of context and has taken on a new meaning: the indivisibility of security interests of NATO and the Indo-Pacific. The difference is clear for everyone. The so-called Indo-Pacific, the West has embarked upon the path of creating a bloc against Russia and China. In order to do that, they have been consistently destroying various mechanisms and cooperation mechanisms that have been created in ASEAN on the basis of equality, consensus, balance of interests. They substitute them with military blocs. AUKUS is a bright example of that, an Anglo-Saxon bloc in Asia, the US, the UK, and Australia. They actively involved Japan in this bloc, and Prime Minister Kishida's recent visit to Washington became the culmination of this policy. Japan has once again embarked upon the path of militarization. They are going to change and amend its constitution, in particular the articles that prevented it from doing that. The process has started. I'm not going to go into detail about the activities of the West at other geopolitical tracks, but speaking briefly about the position of the United States and the West that we consider to be the main problem creating difficulties everywhere, it can be summed up as follows. Washington's line of ensuring dictate in international affairs means the following: we Americans are allowed to do whatever we want, wherever we want, even if it's at the other end of the world. We will do what we deem necessary, and you, all others, cannot do anything without our consent, even if you respond to direct threats to your securities that we create at your borders. I'm simplifying it, of course. Just like Napoleon mobilized the entirety of Europe against the Russian Empire, just like Hitler mobilized most European countries and made them fight against the Soviet Union, the US has now shaped a coalition including virtually all European countries, both NATO member states and others, including EU member states. And now they are waging a war by proxy against Russia, using Ukraine as a proxy, in order to solve the Russian matter. Just like Hitler wanted to find a final solution to the Jewish problem, they are doing the same right now. If we read statements by politicians, not only from Baltic states, but also some more moderate ones, they say that Russia needs to be defeated on the strategical level. Political scientists from various media outlets speak about decolonizing Russia, alleging that Russia is too big and is in the way. A few days ago, I read an article published in The Telegraph calling upon the world to liberate Abkhazia, South Ossetia, Transnistria, leaving Karelia, Königsberg, and Kurils up to negotiations. Of course, it's a tabloid. And sometimes we are forced to read such tabloids because they make headlines from time to time. But no one in the West, and such remarks are very numerous, including in our non-systemic opposition, no one among Western politicians refutes such claims.
President Macron, in addition to his project of European political community, which has been directly proclaimed to be the format where all Europeans, except for Ukrainians and Belarusians, will be invited to. Now I've heard a new idea that he pitched to call a European State Conference. An invitation will be received by the EU, Eastern Partnership participants, that is Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan, as well as Moldova, Ukraine, and Belarus. I doubt that they will invite Belarus. Still, it was said it would be the EU, Eastern Partnership countries, plus, and I'd like to point it out here, immigrants from the Russian Federation, which are actively engaged in politics abroad. Also, it was said, not in the presentation by President Macron, but in the comments that followed later, that this event, the Conference of the European States, could also invite separate regions of the Russian Federation, which intend to maintain their ties with Europe. I think it's clear what we're talking about. The situation is far from black and white as it is painted by our Western colleagues. It reflects the general line towards global dominance, an absolute submission of everyone, with a threat of punishment, as you can see. None of the Western politicians is talking about nothing but sanctions. Right now in Davos, Ursula von der Leyen, yet again, was threatening us and Belarus with new sanctions. We know how to introduce more sanctions, how to suffocate Russian economy, for it to be brought back into recession for decades. That's what we are talking about. Well, there is a saying that the masks are off, and for the longest time, when there were discussions at the UN Security Council about sanctions, about a country which would probably violate their international obligations. And at that point, every time the Western countries who initiated these sanctional measures, they were saying that the sanctions are not for punishing the nation, the population of the state. These are sanctions against the regimes. So where are these assurances now? The sanctions against Russia are openly declared to be aimed at the people conducting revolution against the current leaders of Russia. No holds are barred. No one is observing any politeness rules here anymore. Well, this frenzied attempt and this response, by hook or by crook, using barred holds to ensure the domination of the U.S. and the rest of the world, the rest of the West that Washington has completely steamrolled over. This frenzy shows that historically they're acting on the wrong side of history, and in essence are trying to stop the formation of the multipolar world. And that is not happening by decisions from cabinets in Potomac or on the Potomac River, or well, this is happening just naturally because countries are developing economically. Take China, take India, our strategic partners. Look at Turkey, Brazil, Argentina, Egypt. Many other countries that have great potential. For example, in Africa, they have tremendous reserves of raw materials. There are new centers of economic growth being formed, and the West is trying to hinder that, using the mechanisms that were created to serve their interests through the globalization that was created by them. And here, the role of the dollar as a reserve currencies has one of the main roles to play. Therefore, now, in our context with the SCO and within BRICS and other associations, CIS, naturally, Eurasian Economic Union as well as then with cooperation with associations with Asia, Africa, and Latin America, they are trying to build new forms of interaction so as not to depend on the West. And it's clear neocolonial methods. President Putin has spoken about that very clearly. These methods are being used to plunder the rest of the world now in new conditions. We, together with our reliable partners, with friendly countries, will build such interaction that would benefit us and will be exempt from the influence from those who would like to subjugate the rest of the world. These are my evaluations of the past year. The main thing is that the processes that this year saw, they were incepted many years ago. It wasn't yesterday. And these processes will continue to unravel because the shaping of the multipolar world, its finalization of the relations that are required for democracy in the world and justice to reign in the world, for the UN Charter to be observed about respect for sovereign equality of all states, that would take time. The UN Charter is a great foundation. When it was adopted, it was indeed a revolutionary document. Unfortunately, all those right principles were distorted by the West. The West did not respect the sovereign equality principle. They did not respect non-interference in domestic affairs principle, peaceful settling of disputes, and so on. Hundreds of times after the UN was created, the U.S. have used their armed forces abroad, in the majority of cases in blatant violation of the UN Charter. Therefore, the process of multipolar world taking shape will take time. That will be a whole historical era. Right now, we're in the middle of this process. Sometimes it's hard to see when you're inside the process. Therefore, we keep in touch, we exchange opinions and evaluations, and we appreciate that. That goes not only to our partners in foreign countries, but also to our colleagues from the media. Your observations and even the questions that you're asking us are very useful. So let's move on to your questions then. RIA Novosti, please. Thank you very much. Cristina Lund Rodriguez, RIA Novosti. Mr. Minister, how do you evaluate the chances that this year it will be possible to organize negotiations between Russia and the leading Western countries led by the U.S. dedicated to Ukraine? What questions of ensuring security as part of the Ukrainian settlement would Moscow like to put on the table for these negotiations? Do you think that it will be possible that think that it will be possible that this year, this active phase, the military phase, will stop this year? As for the military phase, an active phase, our military and our president have commented on that multiple times, and he confirmed yet again that the special military operation has its goals. They're not just invented or taken out of thin air, but they are defined by the deeply rooted and legitimate interests in security of the Russian Federation, the interests of the Russian position in the world and our nearest neighborhood. Ukraine, just like any other territory that is bordering Russia, there should be no military, should have no military infrastructure that poses a direct military threat to Russia. In Ukraine, there should be no discrimination or persecution aimed against our compatriots who happened to be Ukrainian citizens, but like to maintain their language, culture, and traditions, and would like to bring up their children in these traditions. And I would like to highlight, in full compliance with the Constitution of the Ukraine, which states that Ukraine guarantees free development and protection of Russian and other languages of the ethnic minorities in the Ukraine. Russian is mentioned there specifically. This constitution is still in place. As far as I understand, we have handout materials. Okay, so they were circulated yesterday. So we have materials circulating that mention the articles of the constitution and specific Ukrainian commitments according to international conventions. We also have a hefty list of the laws that were adopted in the violation of both the Constitution and the international obligations of the Ukrainian state. Some time ago, about several months ago, I was surprised to read an interview by President Zelensky. He spoke on the topic that if they let Russia win, then other big countries would think that they can do that too. And there are many such countries and different continents. Therefore, such countries will suffocate small countries, will divvy up the rest. And I, said Zelensky, I would like to see a different scenario when each person on the planet would know that regardless of where he lives, he has the same kind of rights and he's protected just like any person in the world. So this was said by a person, the interview took place in October. And in September, in 2021, a year before that, Zelensky, as you know, said that in the East there are just species, not people. And if any citizens of Ukraine thinks in Russian language and would like to stay Russian, then for the benefit of his children and grandchildren, he should move out to Russia. So this was said by the same person who said that he has a dream about equality and so that everyone could live the way he wants. It's clear that these beautiful words are said for the benefit of the West. But that gives us a great picture of the current regime, and it's clear why we cannot abandon the foundational, the basic goals of the special military operation. As for the outlook for the negotiations, we've discussed it dozens of times. I don't want to repeat some platitudes, starting with March, when we reciprocated Ukraine's appeal for negotiations. Moreover, we supported the draft settlement document proposed by Ukraine, but Ukraine was stopped. It was told it was too early. And after the spring of this year, throughout the summer and the fall, special representatives were saying that everywhere that it's too early to move to negotiations, that Ukraine needs more armaments, for it to start its negotiation with a greater initial ask. NATO Secretary General Stoltenberg said that this is the path to peace. And Zelensky is pitching very strange initiatives of 10-point plans with everything heaped over: food security, energy security, biosecurity, withdrawal of Russian troops from everywhere, Russian repentance, tribunal condemnation, and so on and so forth. There could be no negotiation with Zelensky because he prohibited it by law to hold negotiations with the Russian government. So all of this Western talk that they are allegedly prepared, but Russia is not, well, this is not entire truth. You asked about the outlook for negotiations between Russia and the West. We will be prepared for any serious proposals. We'll be prepared to respond to them, and we see no serious proposals as of now, but we'll be prepared to review them and to think about it. We see the mantra from the Western capitals that Ukraine should not be discussed without the presence of Ukraine. And this is just gibberish, because the West decides for Ukraine. They banned Zelensky from negotiating with Russia at the end of March last year, when there was a prepared agreement. So the West is deciding, and it decided that for Ukraine without Ukraine. They're saying it's not the time. There should be more armaments. We should weaken Russia more. I don't know who's in charge of the military planning there, but there was a meeting between CIA Director Bill Burns and Sergei Naryshkin, Director of SVR Russia. He spoke about the meeting in general terms. It was proposed by President Biden, and President Putin agreed. This meeting took place. There were no revelations made there. In general, the West, in some sporadic contacts that happen at this or that level, does not say anything that would go beyond its public statements. Our position is well known. But talking to the West about Ukraine only makes no sense, really. The West is using Ukraine to dismantle the security system that used to exist in Euro-Atlantic region for many years. It was underpinned by the principle of consensus, indivisibility of security, solving all issues through dialogue and cooperation. And the embodiment of these principles was the OSCE. Right now, the West is trying to bury it as soon as possible, just as it has buried the Council of Europe. Organizations that were created for dialogue and for finding consensus, for finding compromise, by definition, are now being used to promote the very line towards total domination of the U.S. with the rest of the West under them. So saying to us that, okay, let's do something about Ukraine, but the rest will be ours. Well, no, that would not go. Would have to have a frank conversation. And I don't think that at this stage we need to show any initiative in those dimensions that the West has closed down. They closed down cooperation in the Council of Europe that everyone was so proud of. Besides, Council of Europe has several dozen conventions that do not require a country to be a member of the Council of Europe, but allow you to take part in those, to be party to that convention. And here, the West decided to discriminate against Russia once again and prevent our representatives from taking part in the bodies of those conventions which are open for non-members. And in this situation, our representatives have no chance of taking part in review events, and in these conditions, are impossible to act in. Therefore, we have exited out of the criminal law convention on corruption. That doesn't mean that we don't want to fight corruption, but that means that we don't want to be disregarded by the West and admonished by the West in that format when we don't even have procedural rights. I can give you plenty of examples, but let's move on to make it a bit more lively. Other questions, please. Greece, please. Open TV. You know, there is an opinion among many Europeans that Russia did not put its best foot forward when it decided to start military action. And therefore, Russia is acting like the rest of imperialistic countries. For example, the US, who, by the way, have bombed half of the planet almost. So Russia is also violating international law in the same way and acts in the way to conquer certain territories. Such criticism is very vocal in Greece, in the Balkan region, you've mentioned it, due to the fact that we're also victims of such policy. You probably know the Cyprus issue the best. There is a threat in the agency against Greece from Turkey, and we hear this a lot, this opinion a lot. How would you refute this position?
Well, it's not that I'm going to refute this position. I'm going to express my own opinion. When they say that Russia did not put its best foot forward when it started the special military operation, I would say that this is a very interesting turn of phrase. But, you know, just to dot all the I's, I think we put our best foot forward once the USSR disappeared, and this was mentioned by President Putin on many occasions. In 2000, when he was first elected as president, one of the first visits was to Germany, where he spoke in Bundestag, he spoke German. And in doing so, he personally, as a person, a human being, as President Putin, he committed himself to a historic reconciliation between Germany and our country. And this reconciliation dated back to the end of 1980s, beginning of 1990s, once the Berlin Wall fell. But that was at the official level, at the state level, whereas President Putin made a personal human contribution to this historic reconciliation between the two countries. And let's not forget that Germany reunited to a large extent thanks to the USSR position, because other the countries, the allied nations, were not that enthusiastic about that. And we were putting our best foot forward, as you put it, from the point of view of international law, from the point of view of searching for solutions that would benefit the whole humankind. And we've been doing that for quite some time. I cited the first Ukrainian Maidan back in 2004. The official Europe back then said that the Ukraine was up for a choice, either Europe or something else, but that was 3 years before the Munich speech, and we were hopeful back then that reason would prevail and Europe would understand that it was impossible to constantly lie, to constantly push NATO eastward, despite the assurances that had been provided that it would and was impossible to do that, not just despite the assurances given in private, but also due to the obligations under the OSCE principles, when you shouldn't reinforce your security at the expense of other security, and when no one can, claim dominance. And these are the principles that are enshrined in the OSCE, and Russia and Europe are part of that. And the very same formula has been enshrined in the documents adopted at the NATO-Russia Council at the highest level. And if you think that reckless NATO push eastward, despite our official remonstrance, is the implementation of this very obligation, when I think it's not going to be possible for us to reach common understanding. But I think you understand full well what I'm talking about. You said that we acted as the imperialist nations. Right now, we are often, once again, dubbed an empire, but it's up to the experts, to professionals, to speculate on that. We're a nation, a country, which is home to many nationalities and ethnic groups. We have 150 or so languages. All the world religions are represented among our population. We have respect for national traditions of each and every ethnic group, and as a multi-ethnic, multi-religious country, we have been developing, following this pattern for centuries. And unlike Western colonial practices, we have never suppressed nations that were part of the Russian Empire, and we never destroyed them, never tried to put them into a melting pot for them to lose their national identity, national culture, to become, as Americans, one homogeneous nation. Even Americans failed to do that, and we never sought that. We managed to preserve our national traditions, national identity, specificities, our national languages. As far as the conquest of territories is concerned, as far as what you said, that we have the same very instincts at Western empires, I would say the following. As I mentioned, the U.S., after the end of the Cold War, well, let's take 1990. After that, the U.S. invaded other territories for 300 times or so. And why did they do that? Either because someone offended the Americans. This happens regularly in Central America or in the Caribbean. Or they sought to eliminate threats to peace and security. To cite an example, Saddam Hussein, who allegedly was in possession of WMDs, which turned out to be a fabrication, or Libya, when they wanted to eliminate Gaddafi, who was not a democrat but a dictator. So they destroyed prosperous countries who were not that bad from the point of view of the economic development. Let's take Yugoslavia. They simply decided to dismantle the Balkans, in particular to please Germany. They did not wait for a coordinated line by the EU. They simply recognized Slovenia and Croatia, which made it impossible to rebuild any kind of confederation and the Balkans. Serbia was against that. It was against the idea of the Balkans submitting to the West. So what did they do? Incidentally, when Joseph Biden was still senator, a year prior to the NATO aggression against Serbia in 1997, he said, I am in favor of bombing Belgrade. I suggest American pilots have to go and destroy all the bridges across the Drina. I suggest that we take all their oil reserves, just, to take away that from them. And, as you see, all the proposals of Senator Biden were implemented a year after. And the Time was published, a new edition, and it had a cover saying, "Through mass bombings to democracy." And back then, not a single person was thinking about a tribunal. Or when the U.S. invaded Syria without any legitimate cause, starting to raze cities to the ground. Cities were destroyed, eliminated, Raqqa was razed to the ground, bodies were piled up, and they stayed in the streets for months. Yes, there was some reports by Médecins Sans Frontières, by others, but never was a tribunal proposed. But when the International Court itself decided to look into potential military crimes that might have been committed by the American military in Afghanistan, the U.S. said that we're going to slap sanctions on you, we'll take away your money, and this high institution of international justice decided to keep mum. Yes, you can draw a comparison, that's true, but as I said, we have been protecting our own security because Ukraine was being turned into a bridgehead to undermine our interests in the Sea of Azov. There were plans to build military naval bases, Anglo-Saxon bases in particular, and these are serious threats. Secondly, the humiliation of Russians that allegedly have to have their rights protected under the Ukrainian constitution. And this humiliation was inadmissible because they associate the protection with us, the protection of their legitimate interests. When in 2014 a West-inspired coup d'etat happened, they didn't even make an effort to build a national dialogue. The West sided with the regime that declared anti-Russian goals, that declared its commitment to the principles and practices of Nazism when they bombed Odessa, when they bombed Luhansk. And no one is investigating these crimes. And there are no suggestions to set up tribunals for that. Lastly, a war was started against those who disagreed with the coup d'etat. Then the war was stopped. The Minsk agreements were signed. But as you know, Germany and France with Poroshenko, all the three signatories, except Putin, well, they signed it to better prepare Ukraine with weapons and equipment for the next phase. So do you think we didn't put our best foot forward in this particular case? Because we were the only country that sought to make sure that the Minsk agreements were observed, whereas the others were not so enthusiastic and were simply following the advice from the U.S. And I think that, well, Greece and Cyprus are suffering because of that. I don't know what they are most suffering from. Because Greece and Cyprus and Russia have always been very close friends, and the transformations that have happened in the leadership of both countries have not gone unnoticed by us. As far as everything that I've just mentioned is concerned, I can say the following. For many years, they have been preparing these efforts, preparing forces to unleash a hybrid warfare against us. And this is all well known. I think prime ministers and presidents of European countries especially countries that have had long-standing historical ties with Russia. I'm confident that these people know the facts and they know how to analyze that. So, given that, the conclusion I can draw is quite clear. Either they were made or they willingly submitted to the diktat by the US. Europe is following the US orders, and there is not going to be any talk of any strategic autonomy or independence in Europe. They will not be allowed to do that. When Defense Secretary Mr. Austin of the US said that more American troops had to move to Europe, he was asked whether that would be on a permanent basis or on a rotation basis, and he said, we are going to decide that in Washington. So we are drawing the conclusions from what's happening. And of course, we have taken note of those who were so hasty to support the aggression against Russia. The war is going to be over sometime, and we'll defend our truth. But what comes next, I do not quite understand yet. It's all going to be dependent on the conclusions that Europe is going to draw. Georgia, please. Alt info. Can you hear me? Yes. Good afternoon, Minister Lavrov, Alt Info, David Aklavidiani, Georgia, Tbilisi. Minister, once the special military operation started in Ukraine, we have been watching that this is a confrontation between the collective West against Russia, but not just Russia, because small countries of the region ended up in a difficult position, in particular Georgia. There are regular attacks by radical media and political groups controlled by the US. They're trying to obtrude their distorted Western values that have nothing to do with our national identity and culture on us. Thereby, the West is trying to undermine the cultural sovereignty of smaller countries, thereby establishing its control over them. And the end goal of this cynical policy is to sacrifice small countries to benefit their own political interests. Unfortunately, Ukraine is a tragic example of that. Georgia and other countries of the region are facing the same threat. My question is as follows. Amid these conditions, the question begs itself whether Russia has a clear-cut strategy to counteract this destructive cultural expansion by the West. And does it imply cooperation with countries that could be natural allies in protecting conservative values? Thank you. This is a very broad question. We've just spoken about Ukraine. Yesterday there was a special session of the UN Security Council convened at our initiative. It was dedicated to the threats against international peace and security stemming from the Kiev regime's policies and human rights and the rights of national minorities, including religious minorities and religious rights of national minorities. I know there's cultural presence, countering negative trends through preserving cultural values. All of that is directly related to religion, in particular to the activities of the Orthodox Church, in particular the Russian Orthodox Church or the Georgian Orthodox Church. So when the church, which is not an instrument of Russian influence, it's simply a tool to preserve traditions and history, to pass it down generation in, generation out. And when we see that this tool is being destroyed or forbidden, when priests are detained and stripped of their citizenship, we can see that these are the tools the West is resorting to assert its values. And when this happens, we have to take reciprocal measures. In particular, when our journalists, our political scientists, experts who can speak the truth, addressing the Western audiences. And when they come under sanctions, we have to reciprocate as well. But this is not our choice. You remember, during the Cold War, Soviet scientists, American, Western scientists met on a regular basis talking about the relevant issues of today, whereas right now it's almost impossible. You know, sometimes I've got addresses via absolutely unofficial channels, and, you know, some political scientists from the West are asking me whether it's possible to set up kind of a seminar or workshop somewhere in the neutral territory so that everyone is able to come. In the past, no one asked for permission. They spoke directly to one another, one institution to another. Whereas right now, our Western partners who used to participate in these exchanges are simply intimidated. They're scared. They're bullied. So, I reiterate, I have enormous respect for the position of the Georgian Orthodox Church that is fighting for its values. And on the whole, we've no issue with the Georgian people. Well, yes, there was this issue of 2008, but once again, NATO played its role. In April, during the NATO summit in Bucharest, a declaration was adopted saying that Georgia and Ukraine would be in NATO. And
I don't want to use curse words, but his emotions apparently got the better of him. I'm speaking of Saakashvili, and he decided that he was entitled to do whatever he wanted. And Condoleezza Rice visited, and he ordered to bomb Tsinvala and peacekeepers. Ukrainians took a bit longer for this Bucharest impulse to reach the conscience of those people who chose to expel everything Russian from their territory. We would like to see Abkhazia and South Ossetia build their relations with Georgia. There are dialogue mechanisms that we participate in. Quite a while ago, Georgia came up with the project of joint economic activities and strengthening trust. This is perfectly commendable, and the Western participants of the so-called Geneva discussions between Abkhazia, South Ossetia, and Georgia, namely the European Union and the United States, are attempting to make this dialogue format hostage to what is going on in Ukraine. That's simply indecent, let alone unprofessional. It means that for them, specific tasks to be carried out in a specific region are conditional to their political offenses and caprice. I'm happy to see contacts among people on the personal level develop actively with Georgia. Last year, the Georgian GDP grew by 10%, largely due to tourism and trade relations with Russia. I hope that very soon we will be able to resume direct airline connection, flights between Georgia and Russia, and we see to what extent Georgia, just like the rest of the world, is facing pressure by the West that openly and unashamedly demands that it join sanctions against Russia. This small country and its government have the courage to say that they will be guided by their own interests, economic interests, is once again commendable. Radio Saga, Iceland. Hauksson Haukor, Iceland. Good afternoon, everyone. Just now you were speaking about what is going on in the West. Two questions. How would you comment on the rather interesting statements by Sauli Niinistö, President of Finland, on the New Year when he compared Russia to the cruel Nazi regime. Second question. In the Soviet era, they would often speak about imperialism, colonialists, and so on, and these words are more and more often used today. There are also neoliberalism, globalism, and other new terms. Do you think these words are used in remarks by Mr. Zyuganov of the Communist Party of Russia, but also in your speeches and those by the Russian president? Who is Russia facing today? Who is it opposed to today? Are these notions relevant even today? Or are they now relegated to ancient history? As for the New Year remarks and the following other interview by President Niinistö, well, just as it was the case with Greece and Cyprus, we have considered Finland to be an epitome of friendly relations between our two countries. Even back in the day when those were countries with difficult political and economic systems, social systems, and the rapidity of movement of Finland and Sweden, and I'm more surprised to see that Finland is rapidly changing course and rhetorics, and apparently there has been also a change of heart, or perhaps they have always been anti-Russian, they have just been hiding their anti-Russian position with pretty words about a common European home, respect for the Helsinki Final Act, and expediency of having a summit in Helsinki in 2025 on the 75th anniversary of the OSCE. And I was surprised to see these remarks because he drew a direct comparison between Putin and Stalin. Putin, just like Stalin attacked Finland, Putin attacked Ukraine. And just like Stalin did in Finland, Putin is going to lose in Ukraine. This monologue was rather primitive, and the allusions to fascist Germany probably reflect the fact that Mr. Niinistö thinks about it quite often. I believe that Finns need to remember their history very well, and the very fact that they were hardly innocent victims to the processes before the Second World War and during that war. It's a shame. It is sad to see that various things that had existed in Europe that were created largely thanks to Finland have been destroyed. And in part it is due to the activities of Finland itself, especially given that Finland clearly takes pleasure in its quest for NATO membership and is convinced that it will be a security guarantee for them. We will, of course, draw conclusions from Finland and Sweden's joining NATO, if it does happen. And relevant military and technical measures will be taken on our side of the border. As for your second question, neoliberalism and neo-imperialism. Yes, it's about definitions. I did not mention neo-imperialism. It was the person next to you who mentioned that, who alleged that we were acting just like other imperialist powers. It's a matter of taste, actually. As for colonial habits, President Putin spoke about that, and it is a realistic evaluation of what the West is doing at the moment. Colonialism is about seizing someone's territory and living at their expense. This seizure can take many forms. In the 18th century, they would load their ships with slaves. But today, they simply subjugate another country, their plans and programs to their own will, just like the US is doing with the EU. Iceland is not an EU member state. You are lucky for that, because the EU has lost its independence. It is a NATO appendage. And the EU is currently making public statements. We are discriminated against. The French Minister of Economics said they needed to motivate Americans to be more mindful of their interests because European industry is paying 4 times more for natural gas than American industries. And the shift to liquefied natural gas, despite the volatility of prices in the long term, probably means that production in Europe is going to become much more costly. Interesting fact is, many years ago, Europeans would demand that we not sign long-term contracts and shift to spot prices. And now, when the Ukrainian situation started and they would look for new energy sources, they started negotiating with Qatar, and Qatar said, all right, but 15-year long-term contract is your minimum. Europeans turned to the US, and yesterday I read that the US said, all right, we'll give you good prices, but only as part of long-term contracts. Therefore, reliability and sustainable prospects are more important than trying to chase the ups and downs of stock exchanges. And European industries are moving to the United States. And Western political scientists say that one of the key goals of what is going on in the world right now, and including around Ukraine, is to decrease Europe's competitiveness and attractiveness as a competitor. This will also influence China and its other competitors at world markets. And naturally, colonialism shows in their relations with developing countries as well. Just look where American investment is going. It is very often tied to various political conditions or placement of American troops. I see very little difference here. And since we are at a press conference, I know that many scientists are already studying this new phenomenon, the new era colonialism. It is colonialism as it is. The goals and purposes remain the same: to subjugate someone else and use their resources to serve your interests. And here we have newbies, in the best sense of the word, all world news. Good afternoon, Olga Shetinina. Thank you for the opportunity to ask this question. Diplomacy has a wide variety of tools, including words. Mr. Lavrov, according to you, in 2022, in the world of diplomacy, what word was the most tragic ones, or the most hopeful one? Or perhaps could you say us the word that the world needs to hear today? Oh, that's a very philosophic question. We are more in the habit of thinking about certain phenomena, and describing what we do is probably your job. Thinking of words, well, the word war, and I'm not afraid to say this word, because what is going on is our response that, as our president had said, needed to be given a bit earlier, but it is a response, and it's not too late. It is our response to the hybrid war that was unleashed against us. And this hybrid war is a tool for the West to promote its agenda. As for the word that gives us hope is victory. And what was the third word? Something that the entire world needs to hear. I believe the word victory, once again. Those who want to hear the word negotiations, regrettably, they don't want these negotiations themselves, and they manipulate this term in order to protract this war against Russia. We have a lot of Arab-speaking media. Could we start with RT Arabic? Kasab Mohammed, RT Arabic. Minister Lavrov, according to you, what is the significance of Arab states in the foreign policy of Russia? Have you reconsidered your priorities regarding such states in 2022? Arabs are our long-term and true friends. We maintain regular contacts on a bilateral level with the Arab League, with the Gulf Cooperation Council. Just yesterday, I took part in another meeting with ambassadors of the Arab League countries. In May, I visited the Arab League headquarters in Cairo. I spoke before all member states. And I see that they understand our position. I see that they understand that it's not only about Ukraine. It is rather about fighting for a new world order between those who consider that this world order needs to follow their rules that include domination of the US and its satellites, and those who want this world order to be democratic. It's not the first time I mentioned that. The Western countries that always demand everyone to be democratic typically mean only their internal structure of some particular state. And you have no right to question democracy in the United States, even though recent studies about how the elections were held, how dead people took part in the elections, how one congresswoman got twice as many votes than the number of voters in her part of the country. But as soon as you speak about democracy in international relations with them, they evade the topic, they evade the discussion. They want to see rules in the world, not the international law which provides for sovereign equality of states, but those rules which enable them to dictate their will on the rest of the world. Just like the NATO-EU declaration says, it serves the interests of the golden billion, and the jungle is going to be used for their interests. None of the Arab countries joined sanctions despite the unprecedented pressure by the West, and this pressure was unceremonious and somewhat humiliating. Yes, the West humiliated itself when it put that pressure on other countries. When I spoke to the Arab League before my statement, the Secretary General told me that 3 days before my arrival, they received a delegation of Western ambassadors who demanded to cancel my address. When they politely replied it was impossible because they were friends with Russia, the delegation demanded that after my speech, each member of the Arab League stand up and speak out against the Russian aggression. After that, they were told that each country has its own position, and they defined it themselves. And it's humiliating. They also asked them, don't take pictures with Lavrov, don't take photos. I'm not joking here. The Secretariat put this on paper and sent it to embassies. This motion hardly flattered me. But just for the record, I would like to say that after my hour-long speech, each of those ambassadors asked me to take a photo with them separately. It's a little detail, but these details that many other countries, including European ones, would need political courage to do. We are developing our political relations with the Arab world, and these relations are good. Of course, we need to consider illegitimate sanctions and the agony that we're witnessing in those in charge of the international monetary system. We're building new supply chains that would be protected against those colonists, and we're shifting to settlement in national currencies.
We have a lot of global projects. For example, nuclear power plant in Egypt. An industrial zone is being opened with Russian participation. We have many projects in Algeria. We have promising plans with Morocco. Basically, with all African countries, we have Arab countries, we have intergovernmental trade and economic commissions. At the level of foreign ministries, we have a forum, Russian-Arab Dialogue Forum. Because of the pandemic, we couldn't meet face-to-face for several years, and now we're discussing with the headquarters of the Arab League the possibility of holding of the ministerial meeting either in the region, in one of the countries where our partners see fit, or we're always happy to see them in the Russian Federation. Also, naturally, when we talk about the Arab world, I'd like to mention an apparent dissatisfaction of our colleagues with the fact that the West is constantly demanding something about Ukraine and does nothing on the Palestinian issue. That causes deep discombobulation that the Palestine and the Libyan settlement to boot, after the West has destroyed Libya, is stalling around, going in circles. There are still outstanding issues about Iraq and other issues in the region. They all are of secondary or even third-degree significance for the West, compared to that there is a need to weaken Russia and deliver it a strategic defeat. And we appreciate that our colleagues see that we have a different position. We continue our efforts on the Palestinian issue, on Syria, on Libyan settlement, on Iraq. We have contacts planned with our colleagues from Iraq at the high level. It's important not to leave behind the conflicts. Well, in particular, the Palestinian issue is the longest unsettled conflict in the world, and the UN Secretary General could also be more active as one of the participants of the Middle Eastern Quartet. He could be promoting that agenda as well. Syria, please, Sana, please. Good afternoon, Minister. You mentioned the city of Raqqa. And the predatory policy of the United States that has turned the city into ruins. I would like to ask you about illegitimate, unjust, and unilateral sanctions against the Syrian nation. and the occupation of the part of the Syrian land only drags out the crisis in Syria. And that exacerbates the conditions for the Syrian nation, for the Syrian people. How would you explain? What would be your take on these violations of the United States and their client states, violations of international and humanitarian law, violations against the Syrian people, the ban for the return for the refugees to their historic land? Well, thank you very much. I think this could be a very lengthy conversation. Naturally, sanctions are not acceptable. This is yet another example of Western words saying that their sanctions do not affect regular people. These words are a lie. These sanctions are aimed precisely at making the life worse for the people and for the people to rebel against their governments. This is a platitude. It's apparent. Yes, there are humanitarian exemptions. If you take a look at the volumes of humanitarian aid delivered to Syria, and if we take a look at the UN parameters that UN believes necessary and what essentially arrives to Syria, that's about a half of what is necessary. This is one of the worst metrics among all other humanitarian programs. Indeed, the West does not want the refugees to return to Syria. Even the United Nations Officer of High Commissioner for Refugees has distributed a questionnaire among the refugees. And that actually sort of pointed towards the fact that the Syria is not fit for life and the conditions are not right to return. We complained about it. It was later, the questionnaire was taken out of circulation, but still, the reason behind it is political. UN Security Council Resolution 2254 indeed stipulates that there should be an inclusive election held in Syria. And the West really wants that when it comes to these elections, though the Syrian Arab Republic has held its own elections without any Western interference, but the West indeed hopes at a certain stage to impose these grand elections with participation of the refugees. And they know how to get the right votes at the refugee camps, favoring the opposition, probably, that they're right now bringing up. This is also an apparent thing. It's rather ugly. But just as Americans understood that it makes no sense to bring up some kind of Guaido for Venezuela, and they should work with someone who indeed has the mandate from the people. And the same trend is happening in regard to Bashar al-Assad. The U.S. has special confidential channels on prisoners of war with Syria, but other countries, for example, Turkey, as you know, has advocated for normalizing the relations with Damascus. President Erdogan said that he's prepared to meet with President Assad, and they asked for good services. There was a meeting held between the defense ministers with Russian facilitation. They're preparing a foreign ministers meeting. The Arab countries either never left Syria, they've left their embassies, or now are returning their embassies. For example, the United Arab Emirates. This is also a country which has tremendous experience in mediation, and they're using that for the good purposes, and we appreciate that very much. The life itself will make everyone review these possibilities proceeding from the reality and not from some perfect picture painted by someone in their geopolitical dreams. But one of the main issues is Idlib, so that the agreements on Idlib would be fulfilled. The agreements that it's not acceptable to keep terrorists there. Yes, northeast as well. There should be better contacts between the government and Kurds. We understand the concerns about our Turkish colleagues. They're concerned about this issue. And we understand their irritation at the fact that the U.S., on the contrary, would like to use Kurdish forces there to create a quasi-state at the east of Syria. And so these Kurds will deliver to Washington and would constantly create some kind of irritation in the region. Recently, my colleague, Minister Çavuşoğlu, has reminded that Russia in 2019 has signed a memorandum with Turkey, according to which we have agreed to facilitate cooperation of Kurds so they would withdraw from the Turkish border to a certain distance, similar to a Dana agreement of the 80s. Minister Çavuşoğlu, my good friend, said that Russia did not fully fulfill this agreement. Indeed, it is so. It's a complex issue, but we had other agreements with Turks as well, besides Northeast. President Putin and President Erdogan have signed an agreement and a protocol on Idlib, where Turkey has taken upon itself to distinguish the opposition that coordinates with the Turkey and radical terrorists. We have agreed at the same time in 2018, 2019, we have agreed to jointly patrol M4 road leading to Aleppo. It's also not entirely working out. So we need to continue and strive to deliver on the agreed tasks. They're still very relevant. As for economic rebuilding of Syria, these issues are of tremendous importance as well. The West, by hook or by crook, would like to maintain the channels of providing humanitarian aid without control of Damascus through the Turkish border to Idlib. We have allowed to leave just one such crossing with a condition that legitimate methods of delivering humanitarian aid according to international law would increase. So there would be more opportunities to finance early rehabilitation projects. So not only food and medicines provided, but to bring back hospitals, roads, to bring back power supply and everything, water supply. We were promised that. There was also a UN Security Council resolution, was supported by the US, and for the second time in a row we see very limited progress. This is also a matter that UN should engage more actively in. One more question from the region. MBN, US company, please. Taras Al-Mardin, MBN, US media. Mr. Minister, relations between Russia and the US are not in their best shape. From the Russian point of view, what should Washington do to bring back the relations to the previous level? These tense relations between Russia and the US, do they stand in the way of finding solutions to other crises, for example, Yemen, Syria, Libya, and Iran? Thank you. Every time when two powerful countries do not cooperate or even mostly don't talk to each other, that has an impact on their capacities to find solutions to international issues, which requires joining of efforts. That's an objective thing. What is required for the relations to be brought back to normal states? Well, normal state, what is that? It will not be as in the past anymore. As Stoltenberg has said, that The relations between Russia and NATO and the West will not be as they were in the past. That's what we have said. We said that there will be no more such situation when you are lying to us, when you're signing some documents that going back on your word, as it happened with the Russia-NATO Council declaration, as it happened with Istanbul OSCE declaration from Astana in 2010. As it happened with the Ukrainian settlement agreement in February 2014, guaranteed by France, Germany, and Poland, as it happened with Minsk agreements that were signed not only by France and Germany, but they were also endorsed by the United Nations Security Council. All these agreements were completely disregarded. They were not even going to implement them. They were lying to our face. They were signing that at the level of ministers and prime ministers and presidents. They were signing these lofty promises. So we stopped taking their word for it. That used to be the Russian tradition. When the merchants used to agree on everything, they just shook hands on it. And if you don't deliver later, then no one would even respect you. So we learned our lesson that that doesn't happen when we were promised that NATO would not expand. So we started signing documents, politically binding and legally binding documents. For example, the United Nations Security Council resolution on Minsk agreements is a legally binding document. Now the U.S. is calling upon Russia for Russia to leave the Ukrainian territory and to implement the UN Charter. This charter, among other things, mentions that all members of the United Nations should implement the United Nations security resolutions. And such resolution on Ukraine, on the Minsk agreements, was simply sabotaged. And that's why the conflict was impossible to settle without any additional suffering. That's apparent for me. Right now, our Western friends, some time ago, brought around a General Assembly decision that every time someone uses a veto at the Security Council, the General Assembly should hold a hearing on the motives of voting on using the veto. We agreed to it. We have nothing to hide. We're very open about all of our voting positions. But the question is, why the General Assembly doesn't want to review the matters of such resolutions that were adopted? Well, no one used a veto, but no one is still implementing them. For example, Palestinian issue resolutions. They're adopted at the Security Council. There is even a unanimous one. Everyone forgot about them. But the General Assembly, when they're discussing Palestine, they've been so rueful about the non-implementation. Why didn't they hold a special session about the resolution about the Minsk agreements in Ukraine? Well, some think about it, but no one wants it. Instead, there were discussions on some very absurd ideas about creating a tribunal or a reparations mechanism coming from the Russian Federation. Well, as they say, whatever does it, but all these tribunals are needed by Ukrainians and their masters. Well, not in the whole. They don't need the tribunal, but they want to use the tribune as a podium to speak their minds. That's all they need. We didn't destroy our relations with the U.S. After the summit in Geneva in June 2021 between President Biden and President Putin, where the Gorbachev-Reagan formula was yet again confirmed that the nuclear war can never be won and must never be fought. We have promoted this formula very actively. The U.S. agreed to do it. I have to give it to them that the Biden administration, unlike the Trump administration, supported this statement right away. That allowed us, in January 2022, to make yet another such statement that nuclear war must never be waged on behalf of the P5. And the second agreement after the US-Russia summit was the beginning of a strategic dialogue on what would be the successor treaty after the New START treaty runs out at the beginning of 2026. We started a strategic dialogue with diplomats, military participating, intelligence services as well. There were 2 rounds of negotiations. I think it was in July and later in September, I think, of 2021. It was clear, more or less, what's the next step. Organizational matters were discussed. That's also important. But somehow, after September, the U.S. have discontinued this strategic dialogue. Now, when they're saying that we need to bring it back, well, we were not to tear it up. None of dimensions of our cooperation or context was discontinued by the U.S., not by Russia. Following them around and asking them, let's be friends again, well, it's not up to us. They know that we're serious people and we'll always respond to serious appeals.
President Biden requested President Putin that Burns should meet with Naryshkin. The meeting took place. It was a very serious event. It was quite useful. There was no breakthrough, but a serious dialogue by itself is valuable. So it's not a meeting when you are just simply hurling mutual recrimination against one another. When there is a serious, mutually respectable dialogue, it's always good. The ball is in their court right now. TASS, please. Minister Lavrov, good afternoon. Ramina Zainalova, TASS Information Agency, has a follow-up to the question on the relations with the U.S. I would like to ask whether you understand when the new U.S. ambassador is going to arrive, and what are the prospects for the activities of the diplomatic missions, and what about the visas issued to the Russian citizens, and is the Foreign Ministry doing anything to stimulate this process? I don't know when the new ambassador is going to arrive. I think the official procedure has been finalized. The agreement has been issued. So we're waiting for her. Now, as far as the conditions for the diplomatic embassies are concerned, as in the previous case, I'd like to say that we were never the ones to begin taking any actions to hinder or make diplomatic activities more difficult. What's happening right now was initiated by the Nobel Prize winner Barack Obama in October 2016, 3 weeks prior to the inauguration of President Trump. Leaving the White House, President Barack Obama decided to create some, pettily create some difficulties for his successor. Some diplomatic property was taken away from our diplomatic embassy, and honestly, it was somewhat dishonest. The diplomats were given a deadline when there was no flight from Washington, and there were more than 100 people, diplomats with wives and children, and it took them several hours to go to New York with all of their luggage, to hop on a flight from New York. It was something low, ignoble, undeserving of a president of the U.S. And they told us that we should wait until President Trump arrives in the White House and we'll sort this out. That's what they told us. We took a pause, but nothing happened even once President Trump arrived. And we had to reciprocate. We had to introduce a special regime for a couple of diplomatic properties of the U.S. in Moscow. And they took offense. But honestly, this was not a level playing field. And it was a chain reaction unleashed. Right now, we do not have parity. And the U.S. has a serious advantage in terms of the number of diplomats. You know, because we have different counting techniques for the overall number of diplomatic staff. In terms of the count, we also have to count the Russian permanent mission in the U.S. It should be counted separately, but they're counted as the diplomatic staff stationed in the U.S., and it's 140 people. So the Americans have a very serious advantage. So when they lament that there is no staff to issue visas to the Russian citizens, do not believe them, because we have a few people by 140, but we never stopped issuing visas, and we never asked the American citizens to go to Venezuela, to Nicaragua, or to Cuba to get a visa. So we are trying not to be petty. Let's move on to Asia. China Media Corporation, please. Minister Lavrov, good afternoon. The global Chinese TV network, my name is Dmitry Maslak, I'm stationed here in Moscow. China has been talking a lot about the peace and how important peace is to the world. China has been speaking about its non-confrontation line and its non-alignment policy. But that notwithstanding, the West is seriously talking about a Russian-Chinese alliance, trying to scare the world with this very alliance. What do you think? I think it has not been mentioned yet, but this is a typical tactics employed by the West. If they don't like something, they simply destroy it, crush it. So is Russia taking note right now of the attempts at driving a wedge between China and Russia, maybe some information attacks, some blackmail, the signature technique employed by the Americans? Our relations with the People's Republic of China are going through the best spell ever. Over the course of history, and this is testified by President Putin and President Xi Jinping. This has been enshrined in the mutual bilateral documents. The latest one was adopted back in February when President Putin paid a visit to the People's Republic of China. It was a special declaration, a special statement about the international relations entering a new era, a stage of steady development. This is a very strong document which represents our point of view, our worldview, and the spirit of solidarity between our two countries. And as you remember, our Chinese friends have said that our relations are not an alliance, not a union, but in many respects it's even stronger than a union. These relations are pragmatic, based on mutual trust, mutual respect, founded upon due regard for the interests of one another. In other words, it's the ideal paradigm for building a relation with any country, and it's directly based upon the principles enshrined in the UN Charter. And this year we are going to hit record highs in terms of our trade. It was a little less than 200 billion US dollars. Well, traditionally, I've been using dollars to count. Maybe we should count in rubles. But apart from that, we have very good cooperation in the UN, in the SCO and BRICS in countering new challenges and threats. And of course, there is the cooperation between the Eurasian Economic Union and China in harmonizing the Eurasian integration on the one hand, and the One Belt, One Road initiative on the other one. On the other hand, military and technical cooperation, joint exercises, all of that reinforces our strategic partnership, and there's no doubt about that. The West can see that. You said whether we have any data on the West's attempts at driving a wedge between our countries. Well, you don't need to search for them specifically because these data are freely available. You know, there is a strategy or doctrines adopted by the US. There is also a declaration between NATO and the EU, and they directly mention Russia and China. A little nuance. They consider us to be an immediate threat. They want to be done with as soon as possible, whereas China is perceived as a long-term, systemic, serious challenge. And it's going to take more time to deal with China as the West understands it. But many independent observers, be that in the US or elsewhere, say that Europe is making a mistake trying to counter both Russia and China at the same time. But they think they are quite up to it. The US would be incapable of doing that on its own. You know, let me say in brackets, I spoke about them basically enslaving Europe, putting it to the service of their own strategy for world dominance, and that's what they're trying to do to Japan. And they will try to involve others in such alliances as AUKUS, New Zealand and Canada probably, you know, for the Anglo-Saxon 5 countries to become ever tighter. They're also making advances to South Korea. But in order to pursue its line towards world domination, to contain Russia and to China, the US needs others. It's impossible to do it on their own. So what they're trying is not partial mobilization, it's total mobilization of the Western world. And it's just occurred to me, they understand that their strength is running out in terms of countering the objective course of history, which leads to an emerging multipolar world. Both the Chinese and we can see that in this dual goal of containing both Russia and China, the West is trying to resort to the tactics of driving a wedge between our two countries. And, you know, they want to convince Russia to become a Western partner, and then they will take pity and mercenariness, but they will use Russia to contain China. I don't know who has come up with such ideas there, who of the analysts, but these theories are completely divorced from life, real life. Russia and China see quite clearly that the reality is quite different. China is immersed and involved in the globalization, in the economic fabric. They have a very big economy, a bigger economy, and of course they've got enormous financial resources. And it's far more difficult for China to withdraw from this Western domination than for Russia. For Russia, this process has been facilitated by the blanket sanctions. And the people who were trying to involve us into the economic system have made it clear that it's impossible to trust them anymore. Just a couple of days ago, our president has once again reaffirmed and confirmed our course. And I think that our Chinese counterparts fully understand this threat. And once the West decides to deal directly with China, sanctions will be employed. Well, these sanctions have already been introduced, in particular with regard to what China can do in producing microprocessors and semiconductors. It's been publicly declared that there should be no dependence whatsoever on China, that the West should have such manufacturing capacities of their own. So sanctions will be used. I'm confident of that. So we are not doing anything that would undermine our cooperation, but we are working together with China, with the Chinese businesses, towards lesser dependence on Western suppliers. Almost half of our trade is being settled in renminbi and in rubles, and the share is going to grow rapidly. It's going to be bigger, greater. But let me reiterate once again, China understands full well that these Western doctrines, that first Russia and then on to China, this is not a joke. You know, as the song goes, the West will try to do that as long as they can. The West has already declared its intentions with regard to Taiwan, and these positions are absolutely in violation of China's view and the international law, and this will create irritants for China on Hong Kong, on Xinjiang, on Tibet. China understands quite clearly that staying within the Western system and complete dependence on the West, all of that is associated with strong risks to their independence, to their development. As a follow-up, Sputnik Asia, please. Good afternoon, Leonid Kovachev, Sputnik Asia. In December last year, Minister Lavrov, you said that one of the important outcomes in foreign policy was the complete clarity as to who you could talk to and whom you couldn't trust. So, even though we have reached some clarity with regard to the collective West, but what are our views on the Asian direction, and what are our priorities in Asia, in the East? I've touched upon the subject. Western countries are trying to impose a bloc approach on the whole world. In particular, in Asia, it's trying to obtrude its Indo-Pacific strategy on the East. This strategy has been devised specifically to drive a wedge between India and China, to involve India in its schemes. And it's quite obvious, you know, just as the establishment of AUKUS, which was accompanied by humiliating France with this case for the supply of submarines, when France was told that its submarines were no longer needed. And the West is also pursuing an approach which is aimed at expanding blocks. And of course, Japan is going to be more heavily militarized. It's going to augment its defense expenditure. The same goes for New Zealand and South Korea. they are potential participants of this process initiated by the U.S. I don't know whether this will lead to, but it's up to the governments of these countries to make a final decision on that. But this whole process is aimed at dismantling or even undermining the structures that have been underlying the security architecture in Asia for decades. These structures were based and centered around ASEAN, which has always been the centerpiece of architecture in terms of humanitarian, economic cooperation. They have created various multifaceted mechanisms, such as the dialogue mechanisms between ASEAN and specific partners, the East Asia Summit, which brings together the 10 ASEAN countries and the 8 partner countries, Russia, the US, India, Australia, South Korea, of course, China, and it still exists. There is also the ASEAN Regional Security Forum, which was attended by all the ASEAN countries and the partner countries, as well as many other invitees. There's also the ADMM Plus mechanism. So these are the defense ministers of ASEAN countries and ASEAN partner countries. There were other mechanisms that allowed to talk about economic cooperation, cooperation in countering natural disasters, humanitarian cooperation, mechanisms for academia cooperation. It's still existent on paper. But the Western course is different. They do not want these formats to set the pace, to set the direction for future development. They want to concentrate new processes within narrow structures like AUKUS that are going to be expanded through new members. The Americans are already shamelessly saying that, yes, there are 10 countries in ASEAN, but out of them 5 can follow the U.S. path. The other 5 are not yet ready, so it's a direct advance to drive a wedge into ASEAN to sabotage us, and they are succeeding to a certain extent because internal frictions and irritation are piling up in ASEAN for the first time in history. Myanmar has been somewhat suspended in ASEAN. It's forbidden from taking part in the summits.
And naturally, we are working together with our friends. Right now, Indonesia is chairing ASEAN. I went to Bali for the G20 summit, and the colleagues from the region, I also visited Thailand for the East Asia summit, and colleagues from the region are naturally concerned with the way the situation is unfolding regarding their relations with China that were not entirely without problems. But these problems have long been a matter for dialogue in the interest of searching for mutually acceptable solutions. What the West is currently doing is aimed at undermining this dialogue, among other things. Just like with the OSCE region, where the principle of consensus, looking for agreement and a balance of interests, existed. And later, these principles were destroyed, razed to the ground by our Western colleagues, and the Polish chairmanship takes particular credit for that. Similar architectural structure in Asia, in the Asia-Pacific, can be seen. And right now, there are certain attempts being made to undermine this mechanism and to give priority to bloc structures. Getting back to Europe, I would like to give the floor to someone from Eurasia industry. Good. Editor-in-chief in the Eurasian, faster than some presidents. Industry Eurasia, Editor-in-chief. Mr. Lavrov, my question is going to concern Asia, but Asia closer to us, former Soviet republics. Recently, I spent an entire month in Tashkent, Uzbekistan. I walked around the town and I saw an increased interest for the Russian business to Uzbekistan. Lots of tourists who come on their own to see Uzbekistan. My question is, what are the relations between us now? What interests of the industry are considered? How Russia's relations with former Soviet states, particularly those in Asia, are developing? My second question is, what is Europe's attitude to Russia's relations with EA-EU countries, former Soviet states? Central Asia is a region we are developing our relations with very actively. Aside from our bilateral relations that have plenty of legal instruments to substantiate them, including the Intergovernmental Commission on Economic Cooperation, Military and Technical Cooperation, Humanitarian Cooperation, but there are also collective formats where we, along with our Central Asian colleagues, work actively. The CIS, the Commonwealth of the Independent States, Shanghai Cooperation Organization, SCO, the Eurasian Economic Union, EAEU, and naturally the Collective Security Treaty Organization, CSTO, where three Central Asian states, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Tajikistan, are full-fledged members. But in the recent couple of years, we chose to develop an additional format of cooperation as well, 5+1, the Central Asian 5 plus Russia. Over these 2 years, we had a few meetings at the foreign minister level. All of our friends supported this format. And last fall, in Astana, on the sidelines of various events that took place there, the first ever summit between Russia and Central Asian countries took place at the presidential level. It culminated in the adoption of a document considering cooperation between our countries, covering key topics of the development of the region. Naturally, we are going to pursue this cooperation onwards. As for our other partners in Central Asia, there are more and more of them. And even before the current events, various key players showed interest to this region, including the EU, the US, Japan, India, China, Turkey, Iran, South Korea. Virtually all of these countries and entities enjoy 5+1 formats with Central Asia. According to the data we have at our disposal, I mean both the information from the media and our direct contacts with Central Asian partners, we can make a conclusion that not all of the partners of Central Asia are non-discriminatory regarding others. In our work with the EAEU, CIS, CSTO, SCO, at our meetings with Central Asian countries, we have never, ever said we prohibit you from communicating with this country or that country because we need to be together. We need to take a joint stance against this or that. We never do this. The US, the EU, and Japan do. When they meet Central Asian countries, they say directly, don't rely on Russia. Russia is going to lose in its war with the West, and they make no bones about it being something else than a war with the West. jump the bandwagon, be with the winners, they say to Central Asia. It is another reflection of the mentality of our Western partners. True enough, aside from these rhetorics, they also pressure them, they threaten them. You're going to lose our markets, you're going to lose our investment, they say. Don't you dare help Russia circumvent sanctions, they say. Well, in some cases, our partners in Central Asia and beyond need to consider the interests of companies that have projects in the entire world. And naturally, such a company will hardly agree to comply with sanctions fully, but there are countries that are ready to do that. And we do not insist on all economic operators in all of our friendly states make public statements against anti-Russian sanctions every day. For us, it will suffice if they simply will not join sanctions, and they haven't. And moreover, just like with our partners in other regions, we want to work with them. We want to search for new mechanisms and tools for cooperation that will be independent of caprice and wishes of our Western colleagues. The Italian media. Answer, Italy.
In English, if you don't mind. Okay. Yesterday, Mr. Zelensky said that Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni is going soon to Kiev, and he said that he appreciates the position of Italy of support for Ukraine. At the same time, the Italian Foreign Ministry, Mr. Tajani, said that Italy is strongly in favor of a diplomatic solution, also with the mediation of United Nations and China. So how do you evaluate these positions of Italy, the position of Italy in general, and of course, as a consequence, the relations between Russia and Italy? Thank you.
Italy's position is largely compatible with the positions of Georgia and Cyprus, I have already mentioned today. I mean that these were some of the most friendly countries to Russia in recent years. We had a number of joint events in culture, education. Our economic ties were developing actively to our mutual benefit. And the rapidity of Italy's shift to being one of the leaders of the anti-Russian rhetorics and action, at least under the tenure of the previous government, came as a surprise to us. However, I really like the Italian people, its traditions, its attitude to life. They are very similar to the attitude of many peoples of the Russian Federation in Caucasus or in Moscow or St. Petersburg. You will find a lot of people really enjoying the Italian way of living. And dare I say, the way Italy is currently responding to the unfolding situation probably reflects the aggressive confrontational policy imposed on Europe rather than the interests of the Italian people. I cannot picture the Italian people as a nation being interested in creating new barriers, cutting ties, stopping transport connectivity, building walls and barriers. You have a coalition, and Mr. Berlusconi spoke there a few times, and he spoke about his take on building relations between Russia and NATO, that he made a huge participation. He initiated the summit in 2002 in Prata Kademara that paved way, that took stock of the 1997 Founding Act. Let me reiterate that these documents stipulated Russia and NATO members' obligation not to strengthen their security to the detriment of that of others, or enabling some organization to dominate in European security. I don't think I need to expound on who violated this commitment. As for our calls for negotiations, I believe that everyone, and absolutely everyone, is doing that at the moment. But then Jake Sullivan says during some press conference, it's no time for negotiations. We need to help Ukraine improve the situation at the battlefield. The West and Europe do not have a shared approach to searching for peaceful settlement options. All of these speeches are to be broadcast on TV, to be printed in press. Someone wants peaceful settlement and Putin doesn't want it. And we understand. I feel jealousy on behalf of Prince Latina when you spoke about sympathies to the Italian people. I believe the Cuban people have something to say as well. Good afternoon. Prince Latina German Ferraz. Minister, what's your take on the relations between Russia and Latin American countries at the moment? Our relations with Latin America are going on very well, just like with all developing regions of the world. We have created a ministerial mechanism for coordinating our approaches between the Russian Federation and CELAC, Community of Latin American Countries and Caribbean countries. I have participated in meetings between Russia and those countries, 4 of them. Later, due to COVID restrictions, we had to postpone such events, and we are going to resume it as soon as possible. Naturally, there are countries that we have been enjoying cooperation with for a long time, and our ties are profound and probably more intense than those with other countries. Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua are some of such countries, and we appreciate the history of our relations. We appreciate the solidarity on the vast majority of global affairs. We always support each other during the vote at the UN General Assembly. You probably know that Cuba is subject to illegitimate unilateral American sanctions and has been since it gained independence. And only the United States, sometimes helped by Ukrainian and the Bahamas or some other island country, support them. These are the only countries who vote for these sanctions. All other states vote saying that it is an illegitimate blockade that needs to be lifted. As for developing our relations with our longtime partners, we are interested in seeing other Latin American countries on the list of our priorities. We have no Monroe Doctrine, and when we come to a certain region, we bring no risks of subjugating a certain country to our interest, or promoting, helping some political powers in some countries. Over the past 20 years, we have enjoyed wonderful relations with all the countries in the region, regardless of whether the region swerved left or right after elections. Nothing of the kind. We're going to develop our relations further. A few days ago, the Brazilian new president Lula da Silva was inaugurated. President Putin spoke to him on the phone. He also spoke to former President Bolsonaro, thanking him for his cooperation. I have also come into contact with my colleagues from Brazil. Yesterday I visited the Brazilian embassy, where I made an inscription in the book of memory of Pelé, the great football player. Argentina, Mexico, Bolivia, Peru. Those are some of the countries that we enjoy great relations with. I don't want to skip someone, and we are interested in relations with everyone, and we are interested in seeing Latin America strengthen its Latin American Caribbean unity. Brazil has announced its return to CELAC, which will enable this regional association to resume its operation in the nearest future, and we hope that CELAC will raise its voice in solving key matters that arise when this multipolar world that we always speak about is shaped.
Brazil is a member of BRICS. Argentina has declared its interest in also joining this association. As far as I understand, a number of other Latin American countries do have such intentions. We are prepared to cooperate at this stage through BRICS Plus format, through BRICS Outreach format. We have an understanding within BRICS 5, and we are working together with our Chinese friends to agree on the modalities with which other countries will be able to join BRICS countries for joint work. Possibly, if we speak about the interests of the whole Latin American region, it would be useful that CELAC would review the matters that are raised on the BRICS agenda, so that Latin American countries taking part in the BRICS association would also reflect the interests of their CELAC partners. We have an observer status at the Central American Integration System. We are also building context with Central American Parliament. We have an observer status at the Caribbean States Association. We have regular contacts with Mercosur, with Andean community, with ALBA community. As far as I understand, it could also find its second life, and we'll be very happy about it. We also appreciate that not a single country from Latin America or the Caribbean, except for maybe the Bahamas, joined the anti-Russian sanctions. As a result, our export to Latin America has increased by almost 10%. We have strengthened cultural and humanitarian ties. Quite recently, Moscow, St. Petersburg, and other countries celebrated 100 years since the birth of an outstanding scientist, Yuri Knorozov, who, as it is known, deciphered the Maya script. And he is very celebrated for that in Mexico and other countries in the region. Thousands of Latin Americans, a majority of them Cubans, are studying at our universities. We have stronger tourist ties. Tourism to that region is becoming more and more popular, especially to Cuba, Venezuela, and other countries with good resorts. Out of 33 Latin American and Caribbean countries, we have 27 agreements on visa-free travel agreements, and that naturally stimulates exchange between peoples at different levels. Sky News, please.
Magne from Sky News. You talked about respect for the UN Charter. What respect for international law were you showing when you sent troops into Ukraine on February the 24th, and then they claimed to 4 Ukrainian territories, which you didn't control then and you still don't control now?
You know, to talk about the respect for the UN Charter, it's not enough to ask such a simply solved question, maybe for the US regular people, but it requires a bit of a different approach at a more learned audience. As you know, I've started my statement when I mentioned the foundational principle of the UN Charter: sovereign equality of states is a principle that is the basis of the UN as an organization. If you take interest in that, it would take you very little time to leaf through some kind of literature and to go on the internet and to learn that every day and every hour the US are completely disregarding the principle of sovereign equality. If the US respected the sovereign equality of the states, then after, for example, the situation that happened in Ukraine, Russia has explained why it did it. The US condemned that together with their client states. Well, if you respect sovereign equality of states, and you must do that, you're obliged to do that, let everyone, according to the democratic principle, define their own position, whether they have understanding with Russia, whether they're for Russia, whether they're for the US. No one lets them do that. The United States daily, through their multiple ambassadors and special representatives, are humiliating themselves, running around the world and demanding that everyone condemns Russia. Is that sovereign equality of states? They're blackmailing. If someone doesn't condemn Russia, don't forget that you have part of your assets at Manhattan Bank and your child studies at Stanford. They say that directly, and I think this is humiliating for a great power. Going back to the UN Charter. The UN Charter is rather short. If you have an interest in that, you can also read through. It says that the main thing is the sovereign equality of states, the principle of self-determination of peoples, as well as the principle of territorial integrity of the state. And these two principles, mentioned in the UN Charter at the same level, self-determination of peoples and territorial integrity of the state. From the very beginning of the founding of the UN, when the Charter was adopted and ratified, that these two principles were a matter of question, which has priority. A special procedure was set up. All UN member states, for several years, held lengthy discussions of this issue as well as other matters that have to do with the interpretation of the Charter. In 1970, the concept was born, and it still is in force. It was a declaration of the United Nations General Assembly about progressive principles of international law and relations between the countries. There was a special chapter dedicated to self-determination. And it is said in this chapter that this is a universal principle, that there is also a principle of respect for territorial integrity, and that everyone has to respect that principle. Of those states, and please listen carefully, those states whose governments observe the principle of self-determination and give representation to the interests of all peoples living on that territory. That means that according to the Charter, we respect the territorial integrity of those states whose governments represent the whole population, their whole population of the country. When in 2014 a coup d'etat happened in Ukraine, after Victoria Nuland fed the terrorists with cookies. And when the United States recognized the putschists right away, and Europe, which was completely disregarded, and their guarantees and agreements with the president were completely ignored. Well, you remember Victoria Nuland giving advice to the U.S. ambassador to Ukraine how to treat the EU. She said that that's what, and a four-letter word, that's what can be done with the EU. After that, those who came to power said that they will banish Russians from Crimea. And when Crimea and the east of Ukraine said that they will not submit to those who illegally gained power through a bloodshed and coup d'etat, a war was declared on them, and putschists started to fight against their own nation. 48 people were burned alive in Odessa at the Union's building. There are videos of that. It's available to everyone. You don't even need a tribunal to prosecute that. There are even the names of people who shot on the people who were trying to escape fire and jumped out of the windows. It's all made public. The Ukrainian authorities started a criminal persecution of those who were burned alive. And the world progressive public followed the U.S. rules and show no interest whatsoever to this situation. There were a lot of events that are actually a war crime. Can we think that those who came to power, that they're a government who represents the interest of the whole people, of all people of Ukraine in those borders? Is Poroshenko's government such a government? When he became the president, following the motto that he will find peace in Donbass in a week, he soon started saying that there are non-people living there that will finish them off. We Ukrainians, our children will go to kindergarten, schools, and universities. And these kids in Donbass, said the president of the country, whose Donbass was a part of, will live in cellars, in basements. Did he represent the interests of those people? If anyone has hopes that Zelensky acts in a different way, he also came into power as a president of peace. And he was given different innuendos that his TV series, The Servant of the Nation, when he toppled oligarchs and represented real people, regular people, that is his motto when he will receive the presidential signs of authority. But in September last year, quite recently, in one of the interviews, and I have already referenced that, when he was asked by a journalist, what does he think about the people who live in Donbass? He saw that there are people and they're specimen. And if someone in Ukraine feels a part of Russian culture, Russian language, and feels Russian, then for the benefit of this person, for the benefit of his children and grandchildren, he should move out to Russia. And now, if you tell me that this President Zelensky, with this position, represents the interest of the whole of the population of the Ukraine that he wants to see in the borders of 1999, then I guess it makes no sense to continue this conversation. I think that this is the only interpretation that is recognized by the International Court of Justice about the relation between the right to self-determination and respect for territorial integrity. Naturally, I would like to ask, well, what the U.S. I have already quoted about the U.S. journalists, what they think about the aggression towards Yugoslavia when the Time magazine published a cover through mass bombings to democracy and peace. But I guess you have that in the archives, and you would be able to find what coverage was given to the war against Iraq, the war against Libya, the U.S. invasion of Syria. To Afghanistan, how was that covered? If someone even moved there, they used to shoot people dead right away with cluster munitions. There were many weddings that were shot at. I just gave you the foundation for our actions from the point of view of the international law. Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics could not live under the government who openly declare them to be terrorists, non-people, subhumans, who bomb them every day. Kindergartens, schools. Right now, an accident happened in Dnipropetrovsk. One of the Ukrainian experts responding to how that happened said, and it was clear, that air defense system of Ukraine, contrary to all rules of war and contrary to humanitarian law, was based in residential areas. And that was the reason why this air defense missile landed on that building. The same kind of videos of 8 years of Kievan aggression against Donbass were aplenty. Our journalists and war correspondents are broadcasting live the truth coming from there. And back in the day, even before the Minsk agreements, and naturally after, daily at the line of engagement from Donetsk, from Donbass, were showing the bombings of Ukrainian neo-Nazis, how the civil sector were bombing kindergartens, cafes, and schools. On the other side, there were no journalists and regular coverage. Sometimes BBC traveled out there and they gave quite a truthful report from there, but very soon they understood that the coverage only supports the idea that on the Ukrainian side there is a lot less damage to civilian infrastructure, because the other side is only responding to shelling. This fact was noted by the OSCE not right away. It took about a year or more. We demanded that the OSCE would not only take stock of how many civilian infrastructure has been destroyed and how many civilians died, but for them to show on which side of the line of engagement that is happening, what kind of damage, how many casualties. As soon as we achieved the publishing of this report, it became clear right away that there are 5 times more damage in Donbass and in Donetsk and Luhansk than on the Kiev regime side. Right now, when there is a major outcry about any kind of picture which shows damage to the Ukrainian regime, the same people who kept silent for the long 8 years, when they showed terrible, heartbreaking pictures of what was happening to civilians, to women and children, what was done to them by neo-Nazis, well, the history will judge it, but we should not forget about the international law. As for pathos, I think it would be quite fine if Crimean journalists could ask such questions to the U.S. authorities, but they were not given visas at the West to take part in such conferences. And by the way, our journalists who had accreditation to join such press conference, they were not given the floor. Now to the colleagues from Belarus, please. Good afternoon, Balta. Eduard Pivovar. Minister, I know that you are to travel to Minsk tomorrow. What kind of expectations do you have from this visit? How do you evaluate the level of interaction between Belarus and Russia at international platforms? And why do you think CIS partners, Eurasian Economic Union and CSTO, are far from always supporting Russia and Belarus when voting at international platforms? As for my expectations for my travel, when I go to Minsk, I don't expect anything, but I rather anticipate. It's always a useful meeting in terms of professional activity. It's always pleasant as well. I really like the city and the traditional hospitality shown to me everywhere there. We annually hold joint sessions of 2 foreign ministries' colleges of Russia and Belarus, in addition to exchange of ministerial visits. So we are going to hold the joint college meetings. It was planned for December, but due to untimely death of Foreign Minister Mackay, naturally we postponed it, so it is to be held tomorrow. On our agenda, we're going to have all of the issues that we're touching upon now, the matters of world order, relations with NATO, with European Union, with COE and OSCE.
So these are the structures that are currently merging into one single organism, as it were, following the will of one sovereign, namely the United States of America. Unfortunately, this is precisely what is happening to the OSCE, which I have already mentioned. In an atmosphere of trust, we are going to have a look at concrete avenues of our diplomatic activities. We will have a look at the resolution submitted for endorsement at the UN. We're also going to talk how to coordinate better our foreign policy at the CIS and at the CSTO in particular, because the STO is more advanced in terms of integration. We have joint plans for foreign political activities. They take the form of draft joint statements prepared at the CSTO and to a lesser extent at the CIS, and sometimes it's quite difficult to achieve agreement because the CSTO countries, our partners in the CSTO, have some problems that pop up in their relations with the West due to the pressure coming from the West. Our partners are experiencing difficulties in economic terms if the West all of a sudden decides to do damage to them. We're trying to stick to a very simple approach in these relations. We are in favor of a multi-vector policy. No one wants to slap any artificial restrictions on ties with other partners, with the understanding that these relations should not be a relationship between someone who leads and someone who is being led. No, these relations, these ties have to be based upon a balance of interests. They have to be mutually beneficial. So both sides, or several sides, if there are more than two, should stand to benefit. And if you look at the trade, at investment, as well as other kinds of ties, cultural, educational ties within the CSTO, you can see that they are far more pronounced, far more developed than what the West is doing in the post-Soviet space. Yes, sometimes there are cases when Russia and Belarus, maybe some other country, one country or two countries from the CSTO, vote in solidarity, whereas others decide to abstain. This happens, but, we do not have a strict discipline, whereas in NATO, if you deviate but a little from the common course, what happens. If you see countries who speak against how violently, how aggressively NATO is acting in the Ukrainian crisis, how uninventive it is, how unoriginal. Sometimes criticism does come through, but when a vote happens, almost everyone follows the orders. And I think this kind of strict discipline is harmful. Yes, we would very much like to have a 100% level of solidarity in our alliances and our organizations, but this is an ideal, and each and every case has to be treated separately, and let's not hide it. There are some difficulties stemming from the current state of affairs in Armenia. Our Armenian friends promoted the need to send a CSTO mission to the border with Azerbaijan to ensure stability over there. And we agreed on the relevant documents and the parameters of this mission in Yerevan during the summit. But unfortunately, this agreement was not adopted because the Armenian colleagues insisted that strict condemnation against Azerbaijan had to be included in the document. But we explained if, you want to condemn, it's up to each and every country to do that. But if you want to send a CSTO mission, this should not be contingent on some external statements, especially harsh ones. And we still feel the need to send a CSTO mission to the border between Armenia and Azerbaijan. Be that as it may, even though they are allies, even though this mission is completely ready, Armenia prefers to seek agreement with the EU to send on a long-term basis a mission of civil observers from the EU. But the thing is, what's in question is the border between Azerbaijan and Armenia. So if such a mission is deployed without Azerbaijan's consent, this would be counterproductive. Instead of reinforcing trust at the border, this mission can create additional irritation. And this is how things stand objectively. And the same goes for the Central Asian region and the Caucasian region of the CSTO. We have to be creative, but at the same time we have to have a full understanding of the complexity of difficulties and problems that might arise and the course of development of each and every member of the CSTO, because each and every country comes under pressure. We know that our partners want to develop special relations with the Central Asian countries, and we talk frankly and honestly to all of our partners on these subjects, and they underscore that there are no deviations from the obligations under the CSTO. And the same assurances are given to us by our Armenian friends. So my deep conviction is as follows. Yerevan just recently hosted a summit and it was a frank conversation between the presidents, and it was preceded by a frank discussion of foreign ministers. And I think this is the way to go. You've got to be frank and open about any concerns you might have, any difficulties, and if it's all out in the open, then we will be able to come up with a common solution. And I think the last two questions, let's give them to the unfriendly countries, if they're here. Well, please identify yourselves as unfriendly countries, unfriendly ones. Well, Japanese media, please. Good afternoon. colleagues, Japanese Information Agency, DG Press. My name is Mary Gavorgan. Minister Lavrov, on many occasions you have mentioned Japan and its potential militarization. What's the impact of military development of Japan on the cooperation between Japan and Russia, if there are any channels left? Moreover, Mikhail Galuzin left his post as ambassador of Russia to Japan. When will there be a replacement? And, if you'll allow me, I'm an Armenian, so I cannot but mention the issue of the Lachinsky corridor. What's the current state of affairs there? Well, I think the third question of yours is most relevant to Japan. As far as the relations between Russia and Japan are concerned, well, they exist. We've got embassies, and Mikhail Galuzin's replacement will soon fly to Tokyo. We're not going to try to stall this process. I think it's always important to have a chance to listen to our counterparts and also to communicate our concerns. Apart from our contacts via embassies in Tokyo and in Moscow, respectively, well, I do not remember any other contacts apart from that. Tokyo, of its own volition, has joined sanctions, and on their own initiative, they have frozen contacts and has been coming up with arrogant statements, sometimes belligerent statements. Yes, we listen to that, and just as is the case with NATO's expansion in the north of Europe, we will draw the necessary conclusions in terms of the need to ensure our security in the proximity of the Japanese islands. I think I'm missing some aspect of your first question. Yes, you asked about the relations, and I said, yes, the relations are not that impressive. Yeah, I asked about the augmentation of Japan's military potential. Yes, I said that this is probably not the best, the positive course of development. Yes, the explanation provided is the threat of North Korea, but everyone understands that the same applies to Russia and to China. The Americans are not trying to hide the fact. They are encouraging Japan's development of its military potential and military infrastructure. A campaign has been unleashed to review the constitution, to remove any traces of pacifist doctrine that used to apply to the armed forces of Japan. This probably does not represent Japan's interest in normalizing its relations with Russia. There's one thing I am going to tell you. I didn't say that before. Several years ago, 5 or 6 years probably, when the peace treaty between Russia and Japan was in the works, it was at an active stage. Our president and the Prime Minister of Japan met, and they looked at potential formulas, potential wording in the breaks between these meetings. Our experts and professionals and diplomats were working on a treaty. At a certain point in time, the Japanese said, we do not need a big peace treaty as you propose. Well, our position was as follows. After the war, a peace treaty would have involved capitulation and the border and then peace. But, it's been several decades since that. So signing such a peace treaty, well, it would simply show disrespect for the level of cooperation that by then had been reached by the two countries. So we wanted to write a treaty which enshrines the principles of good neighborliness, mutual respect, mutual confidence, with aspects of economic and humanitarian cooperation and so on and so forth. And so forth. And also it would have set the border straight. And they refuse. They say, why do we need such a solemn, lofty document? We need a concrete, pragmatic document. And the discussion was very simple. First, get the two islands and then a peace treaty, even though the president and the prime minister had agreed on the obverse order. But this is now all part of history. The Japanese were very adamant. First, give us two islands, and then we'll see. You know, as minister, I've been dealing with this issue for quite some time, even though I do not have specialized education. I did not do Japanese studies, but I asked one of the experts in the field about what he thought, and his reply was as follows. Yes, both the Prime Minister is interested in developing relations with Russia. There are regular contacts, cultural events, but if all of a sudden, at a certain point in time, the Japanese decide that they are not going to get these 4 islands, then they will take up a spot in the camp of most ardent opponents of the Russian Federation. I'm simply quoting. I'm not going to comment on that. Incidentally, it's curious that last year a Russian proposed draft resolution on the inadmissibility, unacceptability of glorification of Nazism was being voted on, and for the first time in history, Japan, Germany, and Italy voted against this draft resolution. Before that, they had abstained during the vote in the past. But right now, it's not in theory, but in practice that we see the glorification of Nazism in Ukraine. Nazism is permeating all spheres of life. So it was quite symbolic when these 3 countries, former Axis countries, voted against. The Lachinsky corridor. Yeah, I spoke to Foreign Minister of Azerbaijan yesterday. As per the agreement reached by the 3 leaders on November the 9th, 2020, should be free and open for transfer of cargo and citizens both ways, and also for vehicles both ways. Of course, there is a special provision that there should be no military cargo that should follow this route. It should not be allowed. Azerbaijan has provided data. Our military are currently studying these data. And these data allege that the Armenian side had been using the corridor to transport mines, and these mines were later used in violation of the trilateral agreement to mine territories close to the Azerbaijani positions. There were many mutual recriminations. So we suggested a very simple solution. The contingent, the peacekeeping contingent Russia has sent over there has certain powers under the trilateral agreement, and the contingent can control the movement along the corridor. The contingent has every means to check any vehicle for any unauthorized and sanctioned goods, non-humanitarian goods, non-civil goods, civilian goods. So a couple of days ago, there was a meeting between Azerbaijan and Nagorno-Karabakh. It was attended by the commander of the Russian peacekeeping contingent, so I think this issue is going to be sorted out very soon. Yes, and if you allow, the last question, Russia 24, our friendly media. Yes, this is a must. The last row. What time is it? It's almost 2 p.m. certainly 3. Varvara Nevskaya, Russia 24. Minister, we have not spoken a word about Africa today, and I would like to rectify that. The South African Foreign Minister spoke in an interview to Russia 24, and she said that a bill should be taken away from the Congress, U.S. Congress, and this bill sets forth punishment against countries that still cooperate with Russia. In this interview, South Africa has been speaking about the inadmissibility of sanctions and mutual cooperation. So what do you think about this bill in the U.S. Congress and what it is possible impact on Russia's cooperation with South Africa and African countries? Well, my assessment is precisely that given by Madam Minister as far as for its potential influence on our relations with Africa. I think you can infer the answer from her interview. I do not think that every country can communicate as clearly its position through its official dignitaries. Sometimes, of course, personal characteristics come into play. Sometimes our African partners, African counterparts are not as categoric in what they say, but I'm confident that at the back of their mind, even those who do not comment similar American provocations still are deeply convinced that this bill is deleterious, first and foremost, to Africans because they're not perceived as equal partners. This is colonial paradigm par excellence.
Second, you probably remember Mike Pompeo, former Secretary of State of the U.S., touring Africa, and during public events, including meetings and press conferences, he would urge everyone to stop trading with Russia and China because Russia and China were doing this to serve their own interests, damaging African interests. And America, Pompeo said, trades with Africa exclusively to help Africans. This trickery can only be perceived as such anywhere in the world, including in Africa. You probably know that this year we are going to hold another Russia-Africa summit in late July in St. Petersburg. For that summit, we are preparing a number of events, including a business forum. We are preparing documents on fine-tuning our interaction mechanisms to the new conditions that involve sanctions and various other affairs that you have mentioned, new investment and trade cooperation tools, logistic chains, payments. We are shifting to settlements in national currencies. It is not a quick process, but it is ongoing. Dear 18 questions have been answered. Well, we're not breaking any records. Thank you.